Hey, so in my last couple videos, I was talking about trauma and explaining things about how trauma works, and I'm gonna continue to talk more about trauma and the sort of implications that it has on your life. But before I do that, I wanted to make this video to sort of clarify exactly what I mean by trauma, because I think it's easy to sort of misinterpret it. So when most people think of trauma, they think of any major sort of shocking or traumatic events that happen in your life, usually things that you can remember. And this, although this definitely is trauma, this isn't the type of trauma that I'm referring to. If you watched my last video on how trauma works, you'll know that I talked about the different levels of trauma, including the deepest level, which is dissociative trauma. And this generally happens in childhood. And so this deeper level of dissociative trauma that you generally go through in childhood, it affects you on a much deeper level than regular trauma does as an adult. And so that's why this is what I'm focusing on, and this is what I'm referring to when I talk about trauma. When I talk about trauma and people sort of interpret it as being like what I said before, of some major event that has really hurt you that you can remember or something like that, I think people assume that if they haven't been through something like that, then they haven't been through any trauma at all, and then the things that I talk about trauma don't apply to them. But because I'm talking about this deeper level of dissociative trauma that happens in childhood, this works differently from your typical understanding of trauma, and actually pretty much everyone has been through this sort of trauma, and so the things that I talk about to do with trauma are relevant to everyone. So basically the way this type of dissociative trauma that happens in childhood, the way it works is that when you're really young, you go through a process called socialization, and the purpose of this is to sort of teach the child what's right and what's wrong, what parts of themselves are good and accepted and what aren't, and what should be suppressed. And this sort of socialization happens in any sort of society that isn't fully developed yet, which includes ours, because in any underdeveloped society, people will always value one things and not other things, and so children need to go through this process of learning what's right and wrong to sort of fit themselves into society, because over time society's values change, and so they need to be able to adapt to those values, and this is how that happens. And so the way that parts of the self get repressed and separated from you as a child is through shame. And so anytime your parents or some authority figure shames you or invalidates something that you do or a way that you feel or something like that, you'll repress that part of yourself. And because children can't really deal with their own negative emotions alone, especially something like shame, that emotion gets trapped in that charged state and it gets repressed, and what that is just trauma. And so the way that this sort of socialization happens and the way you get separated from yourself in childhood is through trauma. Like, that's the way that it works. And so socialization happens to everyone. Like, no one is immune to this, and so because of that, everyone goes through some sort of trauma during childhood. And this phase of socialization happens roughly between the ages of 3 and 5, and so because of that, you're not going to remember this trauma. And also, this sort of socialization stuff happens so subtly and so easily that you can still have a very good childhood and loving parents and everything can seem great, but you can still definitely be affected by this sort of trauma because it's so subtle. Of course, some people will get wounded more than others in their childhood, and those people generally have more severe mental health issues than others, and some people grow up to not really have any problems, but pretty much everyone has been wounded to some degree, and the only people who have healed from them have done really deep and extensive work through healing and integration, and that is like very few people. Of course, you can still have like the more major and obvious traumas in childhood, which is what most people think of when they think about trauma. But I just want to make this point really clear that just because you haven't gone through something severe or that your childhood seems like it was good, it doesn't mean that you haven't been through trauma. And this process of socialization that I talked about, everyone goes through this, and so pretty much everyone ends up with some sort of trauma or wounding from childhood. And this healing from socialization, this is what I'm talking about when I refer to trauma, because this is like the deepest level of trauma and healing, because this is what separates you from yourself. And so this is like the most important thing to address and to heal. And so I just want to make it very clear that this is something that everyone deals with. And so when I make videos in the future talking about how trauma works, this is relevant to everyone. This type of trauma that happens during socialization is like the root of all other mental health issues and all emotional issues. And so it's really important to address it, and by integrating these lost and hurt parts of yourself from that period of your life, that's what will lead to the most healing. And that's why this is what I choose to address and talk about with these videos, because this is what will help you the most. So just keep in mind that this is the sort of trauma that I'm talking about whenever I talk about trauma in the future, unless I say otherwise, because this is the most important thing to be addressing, and this is what will allow you to heal at the deepest level. So hopefully that cleared some things up. Please leave a like on this video if you liked it. It helps the channel grow and get this out to other people. Leave a comment if you have any questions. I can help clear some things up for you if you want, if you still don't understand this. And make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future, and I'll see you next time.